So it's a pleasure and privilege to be here. I'm really thankful to ICU and to Luigi in particular for inviting me. With these formal words, let me take a commercial break to advertise myself. My first name, Bhabani, indicates goddess Durga, which is a female god in Hindu religion. My second name, Shankar, indicates a communist god because he was not having any private property and he was not staying with his wife. So he was a platonic communist kind of god. The Nayak in Hindi means hero, the combination of Marxist and feminist. So with this commercial break, let me straight go to my topic, Hindu modes of capitalist accumulation in Bhagavad-Gita. So before I start my presentation, before I talk about my topic, let me give you a theoretical outline. Most of the time, the Marxist philosophy never engage with religion. Most of the time, the Marxian theory of accumulation confined itself with the social structures, with the legal structures, with the political structures. So if you look at today, capitalism is interacting with religion, the institutionalized religions a lot. Walton is asking religious heads to come together to promote a particular type of economic system based on free market. So what I'm trying to do in this paper, I'm trying to expand the social structures of accumulation theory to religious structures of accumulation. And I say that there's a particular form of accumulation with the help of Hindu religious philosophy, and I conceptualize it as Hindu modes of capitalist accumulation. So before I talk about the primary concept, let's discuss about the capitalist modes of production. Capitalist accumulation depends on capitalist modes of production, which separates producers from their means of production. Only you can accumulate capital, only you can make profit by separating the producers from their means of production. Free market can thrive only by separating producers from their means of production. Then the second aspect of the modes of production is the commodification of labor. I'll give you an example of commodification of labor. This is an interaction. When you see this talk in YouTube, in the video, that is a commodity form of the talk. So commodification of labor is essential for the expansion of capital, for the accumulation of capital. Then comes the private ownership of means of production on the basis of control of commodified surplus labor. Capital is a social relationship. If you know how to control it, then you can expand it. So this capitalist modes of production depends on two central theoretical frameworks. The first is regimes of accumulation developed by French Marxist, French regulation school. The second aspect is modes of regulation. This is developed by American Marxists. They conceptualize these two frameworks together and develop the idea of social structures of accumulation. So modes of production, the capitalist modes of production depends on these two structures, the structures of capitalist regimes and the structures of regulations. So these regimes and structures, they are essential to produce, reproduce and make surplus. So reproduction takes place in the field of labor, in the field of social institutions, and reproduction takes place with the help of new innovations, new technologies. Let me define technology. Technology is the productive power of labor. Most of the time we forget the role of labor while talking about technology. Then surplus helps reproduction, creates surplus helps the process of consumption, investment and expansion of capital. So both the idea of production and reproduction takes place within a social structure. The social structures interacts with production process by deciding different rules for the appropriation and distribution of the surplus. These rules lay the foundation of modes of production. So these social structures of accumulation takes place within a particular social regime. This social regime creates different social institutions, different laws, different structures to stabilize the class conflicts, to stabilize class conflict, class contradictions and expand capitalist competition. As a result of which, you can assure long-term market. You can assure a social structure of accumulation which will help capital to expand its base. Without social structures, capital cannot expand because capital, according to Marx, is a social relationship. Capital is not only money, capital is not only market, it is a social relationship. If you don't know how to control that social relationship, you cannot expand capital, you cannot create surplus. So this is where I move from social structures of accumulation to religious modes of capitalist accumulation. If you study the major world religions, you will find that most of the mainstream dominant religions tend to domesticate the masses. Why? It is essential to domesticate the labor, to sustain the capitalist base. Without domesticating the labor, without domesticating the worker, it is impossible to control the individual and community life. So religion helps in regulating individual life, the lives of different communities. In the process, you create mechanisms, regulatory mechanisms about the idea of production, the idea of consumption. You will find most of the time, religions decide what to produce, what to consume, when to consume and how to consume it. So the construction of religious norms regulates social life, individual behavior, which is essential for modern capitalism, whether we live in the age of consumer capitalism or under the feudal regime. You need these instruments, both social and religious instruments. So this is where I'm going to expand the social structures of accumulation theory by taking the example of the Bhagavad-Gita, the songs of God. So before I move to Bhagavad-Gita, let's outline the Hindu religion. Let's talk a bit about Hindu religion. What is Hindu religion for Westerners? What is Hindu religion for Indians? This is the only number I have in my presentation. Hindu religion has 330 million gods and goddesses. If you are not happy with the number, you can create your own. You can be still Hindu. If you don't like male god, you can pray goddesses. If you don't like black goddesses, there are white gods, white goddesses, you can pray them. There are brown. So free market really exists in Hindu religion. You can access them, they are available, there is accessibility, and there is free choice. So really, free market economy thrives within the Hindu religious settings. If you study Hindu religious texts, you can classify them into two different trends. The first trend is Shruti, called revealed. The second trend can be Smriti, remembered text. Shruti is outlined in 4 Vedas. There are 4 Vedas, and there are almost 4 Upanishads, but the Upanishads keep growing. So you don't have a stagnant Hindu religious text. You cannot say this is the theological text you have to read. And these Vedas and Upanishads keep changing with the change of place and people in India. Smriti is summarized in Bhagavad-Gita and in 19 Puranas. And again, the numbers keep growing as per the interpretation of different people in the different parts of India. So this gives us a glimpse of Hindu religion, which is very plural. It looks completely democratic. You can choose your god and goddesses. You can pray by standing, or you can pray in your bedroom, in your bathroom. No need to go to temple. Still you can be a Hindu. So why Hindu religion provides this plural outlook? Why it looks so democratic? Most of the Western intellectuals, most of the Oriental philosophers, they really romanticize Hindu religion because of its spiritual culture, because of its democratic spiritual culture. It looks very democratic. But if you go to Bhagavad-Gita, Bhagavad-Gita is the final text which summarizes all the religious cultures in India. Why Hindu religion is so democratic, so plural? Because India is such a diverse and multicultural society. To control a multicultural society, you need to develop a multicultural religious philosophy. So this multicultural religious philosophy, this pluralistic religious philosophy comes to an end with the theological structure, the monolithic theological structure developed in the Bhagavad-Gita. Bhagavad-Gita creates a monolithic structure. It is as monolithic as Islam and Christianity. You don't find any difference between Hindu religion, Christianity and Islam in terms of its monolithic structure. You have all forms of democracy inside the spiritual practice in Hindu religion, but there is a structure. What is that structure? The structure is outlined by the songs of God, the Bhagavad-Gita. The structure starts with karma, the duty. What is karma? Karma creates conditions. Karma creates internal causations. Karma creates internal causations by which you can really reduce the social structures to individuals. Karma philosophy talks about the fruits of one's own action. Why are you suffering? Why there is inequality? It is because of your karma. So there is nothing external to you. Why are you suffering in this system? Because of your karma. Bhagavad-Gita will answer you that it is because of your karma. So you give this internal indications. You internalize the problems. The free market has collapsed. The neoliberal economics say that market has collapsed not because of the free market system, not because of the internal contradictions of capitalism, but it has collapsed because of the external factors, the invisible hands Similarly, the karma theory tells you that you are suffering today because of your previous karma. What is the solution? You need to do good karma based on dharma. Dharma indicates religion, you can translate it as righteousness. So this karma and dharma can provide artha, wealth, power, fame. This artha can be achieved through bhakti. Bhakti means devotion. You do the karma with complete devotion. You should not ask anything in return. Non-attached karma. You do different work without expecting any results. If you expect anything from your own actions, then that is a bad karma. So bhakti is a way to domesticate the labor. You cannot question the power. You cannot question the conditions in which you work. If you question, if you expect anything from your actions, then it's a bad karma. So these first 4 steps provides the basis for knowledge, the vidya, where you can realize yourself and the other. There was a question during Luigi's presentation. Self, it's very difficult to define self. If I take one of the major economics definition of self, self is about one's own reflection. But in Hindu religion, self is God. It can be one's own self, it can be the self of the other. So, Amartya Sen defines self as reflection of one's own self, but sometimes this self can create identity when you share yourself with others. For example, if we like jazz music, we create an identity of jazz music lovers based on shared identity. So self is unique, at the same time you can share yourself with others. So it is contextual. So with the realization, with the knowledge, when you realize yourself and the other, you get the incarnation. But the final goal is salvation, nirvana, free from the cyclic process of birth and rebirth. This is the state. Salvation is the state where human body or life unites with the Supreme Soul, the God. The final goal can be achieved by following the steps of karma, bhakti and dharma. So what is the historical basis of this philosophy? Why Bhagavad-Gita as a text, as a theological text came to existence? Hindu religion was dominated by the priestly class. There was no spiritual freedom. There was a movement for spiritual freedom inside Hindu religion. Buddhism was trying to evolve out of that movement. Bhagavad-Gita comes up to summarize, to synthesize all these traditions, theological practices, spiritual practices within the Hindu religion. So if you see the Bhakti movement, the spiritual economy of Bhakti movement was developed because the lower caste people, they had no spiritual freedom. They have no right to religion. So Bhakti movement was developed to give spiritual freedom to the lower caste people. They are also lower class people. So Bhakti movement was also created to give spiritual freedom to the women. There was no spiritual freedom for women. Vedas used to be the knowledge of the Brahmins. You cannot read Vedas. If you read, you get harsh punishments. So the whole logic of Bhagavad-Gita is to create a philosophical structure by bringing all the religious traditions together and create a monolithic theological structure in Hindu religion to structure, to sustain Hindu society and to sustain the Hindu social order. So why Bhagavad-Gita is essential, why I argue that Bhagavad-Gita provides philosophical justification to Hindu modes of capitalist accumulation. It solves three innate problems of capitalism. It solves the historical contradictions between capital and labor in the process of production and distribution. Imagine Indian society today, a society which has highest number of billionaires, and the society also provides house to the largest number of poor people in the world. Take one example, one city, Mumbai. Mumbai is the house of most of the Indian capitalist class, and it is the house for the largest slum dwellers in the world. How such an unequal society thrives? The economy grows in 9%. Because people believe in their karma. Our agriculture is dead today. I'm from a farmer's family. My family's agriculture is completely dead. Not because lack of water, not because of lack of irrigation facilities. It is because of the new economic policies, which led to the transition of agriculture from food crops to cash crops. We cannot produce cash crops because there is no market for cash crops. So Indian farmers, they have started producing agricultural goods for the world market by producing cash crops. So whenever I ask my father, why our agriculture is dead, he always says it is our fate. It is based on our karma. So karma creates this internal causation. You don't blame anything. You don't put blame on external forces. You internalize the problem. Everything is within yourself. If you can excel in your life, it is your karma. It is your previous karma. You have done good karma with all the devotion, without questioning the power of God, without questioning the power of the authority. It solves the historical contradiction between capital and labor in the process of production and distribution by creating a caste society. Caste-ridden society gets philosophical justification from Bhagavad-Gita. The 18th chapter of Bhagavad-Gita, the Songs of God, provides a philosophical justification for the caste structure. There are 4 castes. The first caste belongs to the educators, Brahmins. They are the class with knowledge. The second caste is Kshatriyas, who are the ruling class, landed elites. The third is Vaishyas, the commercial class. The fourth is Sudras, those who are servants, those who will work for the higher C-class castes. So this division in the society gets philosophical approval, philosophical justification from Bhagavad-Gita. So the historic contradiction between capital and labor is no more there, because you operate within this structure. This creates the conditions of production, this creates the conditions of accumulation. If you born in a lower caste family and you are alienated from all sorts of privileges, you don't have access to clean drinking water, you don't have ownership over land, you don't have access to health and education. Untouchability is illegal today, but it is still a social practice because of the caste structure. So this hierarchy solves the contradiction between capital and labor, and karma theory provides justification to it. It also, competitions and instabilities are quite innate to capitalism as an economic system. Competitions are essential. At the same time, competitions creates problem for capitalism. because competitions create instabilities. But Bhagavad-Gita, by teaching karma theory, it solves this problem. Conflicts in the process of accumulation of surplus value, profit. So most of the time, if you see the history of accumulation in Europe, you will find they are the basis of world wars, they are the basis of civil wars, they are the basis of conflicts. Violence is a part and parcel of capitalist process of accumulation. So how to solve this violent process of accumulation? Create legal infrastructure, create nation states, but these institutions are not enough. They are not sufficient conditions for modern capitalism. So try to promote religion. Christianity as a religion, it has a strong link with capitalism, but capitalism cannot get any philosophical justification from Christianity today because of the historic interaction of Christian societies with the capitalism. Islam has a strong link with private property and capitalism. If you read Joyce Banerjee's article in Historical Materialism, Volume 2, which was published in 2005, you will find that he talks about the link between Islam and capitalism during 12th century Egypt. But because of the geopolitics, most of the Islamic societies think that capitalism means foreign capital from America, foreign direct investment from America. So the Muslim bourgeoisie prohibits foreign capital by creating their political establishment in the Middle East. In case of Hindu religion, you don't have that problem. Hindu religion gives this democratic outlook, but inside it is as monolithic as Islam and Christianity by creating specific regimes, structures and conditions of capitalist accumulation, by accommodating the dissent. You know, I reject Hindu religious philosophy day and night. My parents call me a Hindu. So, because of this, the whole logic that comes from Bhagavad-Gita, you can see that capital accumulates in a high scale in a country like India without much resistance because of the Hindu religious philosophy, because of the Hindu religious philosophical outlines as discussed in Bhagavad-Gita. So with these words, let me end, and I can elaborate my point with your questions and take your comments while rewriting my paper. Thank you.
I think this is really just a request for clarification. It's kind of a wide question. I'm kind of puzzled by what your conception of capitalism is. I mean, initially you provide a definition, which is sort of a standard Marxist one, which dates capitalism roughly to 17th century, 16th century England, and then it spread. But then, right now you mentioned 12th century Egypt and Muslim society, the Bhagavad-Gita. So it seems like you're collapsing capitalism into something ahistorical, always there, it's always been around. And so then, are you just meaning class society? And that's different than capitalism. I mean, here you're talking about capital labor, but feudalism didn't have capital labor in the same sense. Or if you want to say it did, that's fine, but then you have to drop the earlier part of your presentation where you use a Marxist category. Because none of the people you mentioned, either the American SSA people or the French regulation theory people, believe the account of capitalism which predates 15th, 16th century. So, I mean, so the first question is, maybe you just mean class society, and feudalism or the Asiatic mode of production was what Hindu Bhagavad-Gita scriptures consolidated and stabilized. But then you have to change your account entirely. And if it's not that, then you have a problem with the theory of capitalism. But if it is that, then I guess the question becomes, is there any, is it just basically all religion stabilizes social inequality? Is that the general claim? Or is it a little more precise than that? So that's basically it.
Thank you. I I'll answer your point in two ways. The first is my theoretical outline comes from a historical, non-historicist reading of Marxist philosophy, because I cannot locate the growth of capitalism in India through the transition debates from the slave society to primitive feudal capitalist society. I cannot locate this transition in Indian society for two reasons. Because take for example Gujarat, which is one of the most advanced industrial state, and at the same time, if you see its society and politics, it is under the most right-wing religious Hindu right-wing forces. So capital and religious right-wing forces can collaborate and work together. You can see the nature of advanced capital in a society like Gujarat. At the same time, you can see the feudal structures, feudal social structures, they can move together. So you cannot really separate, you cannot locate the growth of capitalism in India through transition theory. So my reading of Bhagavad-Gita is based on non-historicist Marxian analysis.
So just to be clear, you are actually saying that when the Bhagavad-Gita was first composed and circulated, India was properly understood at the time to be a capitalist economy?
No.
Okay.
This is where I departure from Marxist analysis. I see the continuity and change.
Okay.
I see the continuity and change. You can see the features of feudal, primitive features even in the process of production and in the society. At the same time, you can see advanced capital together.
Sorry, can you give me one example? And it'd be great if for this, you actually went back to your slide when you listed three features: the commodification of labor, the separation of owners from the means of production, and the private ownership, right? The three constituent features of capital according to Marx. That's roughly right, the one before. Now, I'd love to know where in ancient India the producers were not also on the land that they were working as they were in Europe, and that's why they weren't capitalists. There's a reason these are features, right? Because capital has a logic. It's not just whatever you want to call an economy with inequality, which is how most Marxists seem to use the term. No, Marx meant something quite specific by the term. But you're not using it in a very specific way.
Because to be a Marxist in India, I have to reject aesthetic mode of production. You cannot be a Marxist and subscribe to aesthetic mode of production, which is absolutely irrelevant to Indian context. Yes, I can locate these three features in Bhagavad-Gita. For example, the first feature of modes of production. Karma theory, you alienate the labor not by legal structures, but by spiritual processes. You do karma because they are non-attached karma. You work, but you don't claim your ownership over the work. You don't have an ownership over your labor. You domesticate the work and the worker together. It's not a mass domestication. Because in case of Christianity, there is a process of mass domestication. You go to the church, you practice certain, texts, certain, religious practices. In Hindu religion, you don't have that, specific structure. You cannot domesticate the masses by using Hindu religion because it's so diverse. So what Bhagavad-Gita does, Bhagavad-Gita domesticates the worker and the work itself. And then comes the idea of purity and impurity, where you really control the process of production and consumption. There is clear discussion in Bhagavad-Gita what to eat, what not to eat.
Yeah, I'm having multiple problems with linear analysis. So, it's hard for me to express it in a quick reaction. But the first initial problem is you have a linear extrapolation from the Bhagavad-Gita, which is more than 2,000 years old, to 21st century capitalism in India. In between, that means you have to ignore more than 2,000 years of history. Let me just try and explain this, and I'm sure you have explanations for this, so it's probably my lack of understanding, which includes movement within Hinduism. Bhakti was closed. It ignores Islam entirely, which has been a huge factor in any development of socialization in India. I mean, you cannot, it ignores Buddhism, of course, it ignores Sikhism, it ignores Jain, which is very pro-capitalist, if you want to call it that. So that's one. It even ignores, and you talk about it, but it ignores Hindu fascism, which is what Gujarat is, which is actually a fairly 20th century modernization of Hinduism by people following European fascism and adopting it in India. So, that connection, Bhagavad-Gita, Islam is saying that Mussolini is Christian. They happen to be Hindu, but they have about as much connection. They just draw the inspiration from there. So, it ignores all that and gets to 21st century. So that's one, it's too great a historical leap over 2,000 years of history. The second is, the Bhagavad-Gita, for me at least, and I admit I'm not Hindu and I'm perhaps not as well versed in religious texts, but for me, you're really talking about money, the laws of money, which is the caste system. But Bhagavad-Gita is on duty, it's a philosophical text. It is really money, the laws of money as it is, which lays down the caste system. Right? So if you just go to the law of money and say, there is a foundation for social order, which helps capitalism. Perhaps that's your argument. Now, if you go to money, and you need to look at money is actually anti-capitalist. If you also put it, the commercial class is on the third rung of money. Right? So if you look at money, it is not anti-capital, but it tries to push capital further down from knowledge. Because who has knowledge? The Brahmins. The Brahmins set the laws by which the kings who have force, the ability to exact violence, and land, right, means of production at that point, had. But in the capitalists, commercial class, the petit bourgeois, who by the way were very much involved, as you know, in the Hindu nationalist project and are the main backbone of the BJP right in India in terms of Hindu nationalism. So they had a very different project, and for them capital comes in on a higher basis. But if I could draw an exact similar analogy and say that the Bhagavad-Gita and the laws of money to some extent support communism. Because in the end, if you looked at all communist leaders, even including the current ones who just got defeated in Bengal, they were actually elite people who said, we are intellectual elite, the vanguard, and we know exactly what's good for you. Which sounds a lot like the Brahmins, and they were actually happened to be a large chunk of the Brahmins, saying, we are the possessors of knowledge, and we know how to order society for the rest of them, and everybody will be according to their means of production. So I could draw the same analogy from money, which is where I think you should be going around in Bhagavad-Gita for that. Because what Bhagavad-Gita is establishing is that there's a constant conflict between duty, right and wrong, between duty and justice, it's establishing this constant conflict, which helps to explain how Indians, and I agree with that point, can live with contradiction quite easily. And I'll give you a small example of how capitalism disrupts. And there's many examples. I'll give you a very small example of how capitalism disrupts even class structure. For example, the most non-capitalist society in India and the most feudal are the same, which is Bihar. Right? They've not broken the feudal order. So there's the landlords, and there's a lot of conflict in Bihar, a lot of violence in Bihar, there's Maoists, etc., because of the old pre-capitalist society. Now, there was a really interesting study which actually came out recently, which talked about how, because there is such poor economic conditions in that state, I'm not sure which state from, Bihar has it, it's generally recognized in India as having poor economic, there's a lot of economic migration. Now that migration has moved up the caste ladder, which is very much prevalent in Bihar, more than other places. I mean, if I go from Punjab to Bihar, I'm shocked, because for me, caste is because of my own experience, it's much more subdued in Bihar, perhaps because of Sikhism, and that's the polarity. And caste means very different things in very different parts of India. But in Bihar, that economic malaise creeps up the caste order, and due to the general malaise in agriculture, and I have slightly different, but that's a collateral point of yours, slightly different causes for that. But because that economic malaise creeps up the caste order, the petty landowners, who are also higher up in the caste order, are also becoming economic migrants. So they're coming to Delhi, they have some education, right? And they are being forced to work. So in fact, somebody did a study that the majority of security guards and parking attendants in Delhi happen to be of a particular caste strata from Bihar, who never tell what they're doing in Delhi because it breaks their caste mold. But they somehow have gravitated towards this thing. So there's capitalism being disrupted and actually people being ashamed of their caste beliefs, rightly or wrongly, because of a dictate of free market of labor, etc. So this is a small example. I hope I've done 3 categories of.
I think quite answer. Thank you for your intervention, and there are many points. Let me take the point on money. Capitalism is not only about money, and Bhagavad-Gita talks about property relationships more than money. Artha is more about property relationships, property, than the narrow aspect of property called money. So Bhagavad-Gita in 2 chapters basically, chapter 6 and 7 talks about artha, which is wealth. You are saying that Vaishyas, they are the commercial class, but they work under the guidance of Kshatriyas, the second in the rank and first in the rank. Most of the time, the Brahmins listen to the dictates of Kshatriyas. So you can use the Pareto, Muska and Michael's circulation of elites theory to justify that point. So Bhagavad-Gita really justifies the caste structure, and it talks more about property, less about money. In terms of your criticisms on avoiding the history, 2000 years of history, yes, I did. In the beginning, in the beginning of my book, I talk about it's a non-historicist reading of Marxian analogy, because of two, 3 reasons I find it difficult. Because as you rightly gave the example of Gujarat, you will find all tendencies of different societies. If you take Marxist transition theory, you will find the most primitive form of production, primitive features, social features in the society, like sati, the practice of sati, it is still there in some parts of Rajasthan. Dowry, it is still there in North India, in East India. So you can see there is a relationship. But again, coming back to my work on Bhagavad-Gita and Hindu modes of production, I'm trying to expand the social structures of theory by interpreting Bhagavad-Gita. So you can say I'm trying to navigate away from the social structures to religious structures. Thereby, I have lots of limitations, lots of philosophical gaps to address. So it's a new concept I'm trying to push. And I find the problems. Robert Boyle was there in Istanbul last week when I was making a presentation. I said regulation theory is a Eurocentric regulation theory to understand capitalism, because regulation theory, in Robert Boyle's book, which was published in 1990, he talks about modes of regulation based on competition. It starts from 1950 to 1930. Then he takes monopolistic modes of competition from 1930 onwards, based on mass production, based on origin. So there is a limitation even within the regulation theory to understand capitalism. So I think the whole idea of regulation theory comes from reading industrial societies, primarily US for that matter, in case of regulation theory. So what I'm trying to do, I'm interpreting Bhagavad-Gita by using Marxian categories and expanding social structures of accumulation to religious structures. So
just talking originally, you believe that the religious, because Brahmins were on top, they created social order, or were they a tool used by the people in charge, the kings, who control the means of production, which is land, to order society? Who came first?
I think, it's like chicken-egg dilemma. I think I don't believe in this debate between structure and agency, institution and process. Processes create institutions, and institutions create its processes. So they are mutually reinforcing. Even the history of Bhagavad-Gita, there are lots of debates among historians. People say it's a product of 6th century. Some people say like 2010 Bhagavad-Gita, which was written by Ramachandran. He says the history of Bhagavad-Gita is from 400 AD onwards. So there are lots of debates on the time frame about the social roots of Bhagavad-Gita, about the historical roots of Bhagavad-Gita. That's why I avoid that debate. I refer to them in my footnotes, but I avoid that debate because I cannot engage in that debate. I'm not a historian. So what I do, I take the principles of Bhagavad-Gita and see how it falls within the logic of regulation school and social structures of accumulation theory, and expand the concept to religious modes of accumulation, and I call it as a Hindu modes of accumulation, because it is not about mass domestication like Islam and Christianity. It is about the domestication of work and worker, individual level. In chapter 1, Bhagavad-Gita talks about family dharma. Why should you fight your own brothers for property? Because it is your family dharma. So family as a unit of consumption and production, you create.
That's from the Mahabharata. It's a very different context why you fight. It's a duty because they violated the laws of God and kings.
Chapter 1 and chapter 2.
Right. Which is the
Bhagavad-Gita is a part of Mahabharata.
Right. But it's not because of...
No, Bhagavad-Gita is a part of Mahabharata. Bhagavad-Gita is the 10th chapter of Mahabharata.
Exactly.
So chapter 1 and chapter 2 talks about the family dharma, family religion. So family as a unit of production, as a unit of consumption, you really create regulations there. So what I do, I'm using these philosophical categories to expand a concept, and there are many limitations. I'm happy to debate and happy to acknowledge the limitations. Yeah.
So I have a real simple question. There's lots of moments of resistance in the history of India, right? And the Bhagavad-Gita was there the whole time, doing its thing. And nevertheless, people did something very different, right? So my question is, you tell an anecdotal story of when you're speaking with your father. And so let's just pretend that Hinduism, whatever that is, whether it's the British changing it or over time, Islam, all that. Let's just say we removed it. It's just poof, gone, right? And somehow you have some similar situation. It seems to me like what you're suggesting is if this was gone, then Dad would say, well, it's Pepsi who took the land and we're angry and the Communist Party's over here and I'm glad you're reading these texts, son, let's go, let's go somewhere. So my question is, how do you explain it? If this had such a huge role, how is it that so many times people who still consider themselves Hindu, right, didn't consider themselves communists, were able to rise up and overthrow and rebel? How does that fit into the theory?
It's a very good question. I can give you historical references. Bhagavad-Gita was used by Tilak. It was used by Mahatma Gandhi during the freedom struggle as a source of inspiration for the masses to rise up against British colonialism. If you read Bhagavad-Gita written by Tilak and Gandhi, they use the theology to inspire the masses that we have the power to stand against the British colonialism. So even the Marxists have used Bhagavad-Gita, like Das and Sardesai's book on Marxism and the Bhagavad-Gita. It uses, there are features inside the Bhagavad-Gita you can use for the mass mobilization. Mass mobilization for a resistance movement is different from, accommodating the resistance. I don't know, if you see the resistance movement today in India, there are different resistance movements going on in India, in all parts of India. But most of the time, the resistance movements are weak because Bhagavad-Gita really weakens the movement by creating this inner logic. People blame their own fate. The displaced people's movement. I have some ethnographic studies to justify some of my arguments. I was doing field work in Orissa among the displaced people in South Orissa, displaced people in Kalahandi and Jaspur. I find the people always blame, they don't blame the industrial policy of the government, they don't blame the rehabilitation and resettlement policy of the government, they blame their own fate. They are saying that we are unfortunate because we have mines under our house, you know. So people really blame themselves more than blaming the government. I'm not saying people don't blame the government, but sometimes it really internalizes the crisis. So resistance movement is there, and people have used Bhagavad-Gita to mobilize the masses, even during the Indian freedom struggle. But somehow it's my feeling that Bhagavad-Gita really helps to accommodate capitalist system within its social structure.
If I just push back on that for a second. So what I hear you saying is that within the text, there's one tradition of reading it that says do nothing, or you know, sort of just reaffirm the sense of duty, internalize all those things. And there's another tradition that maybe it's a noble lie. So here's my question. So there's another tradition that says no, self-determination, seize the moment, we can overcome. So my question is your argument that there is something inherent in the text that leads towards the do nothing, and the other approach is a noble lie, right? So Gandhi actually, as a British lawyer, says, I'll use the text but people will buy it, even if I don't believe it. If that's the case, if it's a noble lie and it really promotes the other one, then what's the question that comes out of that for me is like, okay, so what is the imminent or like the logic that's inherently quote unquote capitalist in the text as opposed to do nothing? That's one set of questions. And then if it isn't just a noble lie, if it really has the potential for, you know, some sort of like mass mobilization, divine agency or something, you have a different set of questions about the logic. Then it just seems like the text is like any other text, but the question is, how did it specifically structure the social forces you're talking about? Which would be interesting to do, but I don't see here.
There are different readings of Bhagavad-Gita. Even there are different translations and different interpretations of Bhagavad-Gita. There is a Marxist interpretation of Bhagavad-Gita which was published by Leftward in 2005. But its philosophical contents, its structures are universal across India. Before Bhagavad-Gita, Puranas are different, Upanishads are different. Even the Vedas used to be interpreted differently in India as per the change of place and people. But Bhagavad-Gita, its philosophical tenets are same: karma, dharma, bhakti, jnana, vidya, mukti. These structures are universal. It has universal tendencies across India. You can see the militant resistance movements are taking place in the indigenous areas because the tribal communities, the indigenous communities are not Hindus. They don't believe in Gita. So the Maoist movement, the radical left-wing movement is taking place in the indigenous areas more than the places where mainstream Hindus live. So you can see the universal tendencies of Bhagavad-Gita and its impact on Indian culture. Again, when people say Indian culture, you really, locate in Western eyes. There is nothing called Indian culture. Even there is nothing called Oriya culture, culture in the state of Orissa. because culture differs from place to place, and the language changes in each and every 3 kilometers. You have different social practices. So, but the appeal of this text, Bhagavad-Gita, is pan-Indian, and you will find minimal impact of Bhagavad-Gita among indigenous communities. Hindu right-wing forces or Hindu fascist forces are trying to convert the tribal communities, the indigenous communities, into the Hindu religion, because the tribal communities, the indigenous communities, have constitutional protection over their natural resources. The only way to dismantle the state protection to the indigenous communities is to dismantle their identity, their religious identity, their social practices. Once they are Hindus, 5th and 6th schedule of Indian Constitution will not be applicable. What is the definition of indigenous areas? They are the mineral map of India. Most of the mineral resources are based in the tribal areas. So once you convert tribals into Hindu religion, you can access the resources. So now the Hindu right-wing forces, with its organizational wings like RSS and Vishwa Hindu Parishad, they try to mobilize the tribal communities into the Hindu social order. By changing their identity, you can access to natural resources. People like you and me, we cannot go and buy land, we cannot access the mines in the tribal areas because of the legal protections. But once they will be Hindus, they don't enjoy those legal protections. Yeah.
And what are some examples about how the Hindu right wing is using the Bhagavad-Gita to convert these indigenous populations? And is there a connection between the Hindu right wing and the ones who benefit from this religious capitalist accumulation? I mean, is there any direct linkage?
You can see the historic interaction of Hindu right-wing forces with Bhagavad-Gita from the beginning. Actually, they learned how to develop these missionary-style activities from the Christians during the colonial era. So Bhagavad-Gita really provides them the philosophical justification to work, to protect one's own dharma. When the protagonist in Bhagavad-Gita, who is from a lower caste, and when Arjuna, who is the warrior, he asks Krishna that I don't want to fight with my fellow brothers, my teachers, by killing them, what can I get? Krishna replies, Krishna says, it is your duty to protect your family dharma. So killing is justified when you protect your family dharma. So you have this tendency, justifications for violence in terms of morality, and Hindu right-wing forces often use Bhagavad-Gita to get justification for their own activities. And there are many interpretations of Bhagavad-Gita to use it as a text which will justify Hindu right-wing forces. The Narendra Modi, the Chief Minister of Gujarat, who is a Hindu fascist, he uses the teachings of Bhagavad-Gita to kill Muslims. To justify, he uses the term Ram Rajya, the rule of Ram, which comes from Hindu tradition.
But not from Bhagavad-Gita.
No, it doesn't come from.
It does from Ramayana.
Yeah, Ramayana. That's another
different
thing.
text.
But he uses these traditions. He uses the text to justify his actions, to justify his politics.
Don't all politicians do that? I mean, can't you read a text in any way and major, text important to the culture and the society? I mean, isn't that what the politicians do? Just wondering about, so I'm trying to understand the usefulness of the Bhagavad-Gita, specifically this critique, in addressing a specific problem of emancipation of, indigenous populations that we have. It's really the Bhagavad-Gita that's the problem, and to me that argument doesn't seem to be.
Yeah, actually, they do teach Bhagavad-Gita to indigenous communities while converting. They do certain rituals with the use of Bhagavad-Gita. So, how to justify? I lived in a RSS school during my field work in Bhabani district. They use Bhagavad-Gita in local language. They translate Bhagavad-Gita into local language and use it to mobilize the tribals. The tribal is a derivative term, the indigenous communities. So we can see the usefulness of Bhagavad-Gita.
Was it the Vanvasi Kanyana?
Yeah. Drawn by Vishnu also.
Yeah, I have a question. You said that capitalism has no justification in Christianity, but in not such a religion, for example, your religion, your wealth is the measure of, so to say, your availability to get heaven. And Protestant religions oblige people to behave in some kind of proper way. And also there is another plural religion which is very democratic and tolerant. This Japanese Shinto. Do you think your theory might be expanded on this theory, on these religions only, or maybe on all religions? Because the religion somehow, all religions somehow oblige people to regulate life and in a good way. My question.
I cannot just generalize my argument all religions, but I can assert my argument again and again that Hindu religion creates specific conditions, and that condition allows capital to accumulate, and I call it Hindu modes of accumulation. I don't think I can expand this argument to all the religions.
Yeah, but all religions, I mean, that all religions proclaim somehow their only one truth. I mean, that the religion is, Christianity, Buddhism is the only one truth religion. So if a person is really religious, he's the only one. So how could you regulate some kind of concurrent relationships? How could the person who believes that it is his only truth, that he is the only one who is right, how could he regulate the relationships between, for example, his religious people and Christianity, for example, Christianity, okay. So I just don't understand the religion is always the only one truth. So then you are a Christian, you are the only one, you have the only one truth, because your truth is addressed to God. You can't discuss it, because it's out of the empirical experience. How could it relate to the relationships in concurrent?
This is where I see the unity and contradictions in religion. The contradictions are from dismantling the organic relationship between different individuals by defining them as Christians, Hindus and Muslims based on their theological practice, based on their spiritual practice. But the unity is, to control the level of power, to control by creating certain religious laws. So this is where I see the unity of religions, and the contradiction comes from the, dismantling of social relationship. My relationship with you is organic, is natural, as social beings, as individuals, as human beings. But when we locate our identities in terms of our spiritual practice, immediately you will say, oh, Bhabani, you are a Hindu, I'm a Christian. And then the identity moves further. Black Christians, Dalit Christians, African Christians, American Christians. So this unending identity comes to play in our social relationships that dismantles our organic relationship with each other. So you can see the unity and contradictions while comparing different religions, and I don't have the authority over all religions, and I cannot really claim.
So before we break, we have actually discussed it, Discussants, who got imperial, it's like overrun, and from all of us, and so I just wanted to open up for Alfonso to have a shot at reflecting.
Thank you, John.
here have said many things that were also things that I might have asked. There is one that really I would like to ask. To what extent is religion, that was something that stabilizes any social arrangement, could not stabilize something that is not capitalistic? So would it be really impossible for a Hindu to choose one of these 330 million deities and find one that is very close to, say, a Marxist deity and simply just worship it and then say, well, I am actually being true to the Hindu religion? He could even think of karma and say, well, find an interpretation to it or to dharma so as to simply legitimize his critiques to capitalism and think how it can change. I mean, I could draw like an analogy to how, say, in Christianity, well, how Christianity once was. I mean, in the early Christian communities were martyrized, really simply reflecting some feeling that perhaps they had before, and perhaps it was simply actually helped them to do this and to legitimize it and to rid their lives. And suddenly it changed afterwards. So maybe, say, in the Hindu religion, there could be something like that could happen and, well, somehow tackle capitalism.
It's a very good point, but the pluralistic tradition in Hindu religion comes to an end with the original growth of Bhagavad-Gita. There was no monolithic theological structure in Hindu religion before the Bhagavad-Gita. So Bhagavad-Gita brings an end to those pluralistic practices. Like there is also hierarchy among gods and goddesses. You know, you can find that in the text in Greek Veda, which documents 330 million gods and goddesses. So the entire pluralistic practice comes to an end with Bhagavad-Gita. That's why it creates a specific structure. Before that, there was no structure. There was no religious structure. You know, if you visit temples from its architecture, you can see the difference. South Indian temples are so different from North Indian temples. And in temples also you can find erotic images which talks about the social systems of those period. The state from which I'm coming from Orissa, there is a Sun temple which depicts all kinds of erotic images. You will find lesbianism, you will find, you know, homosexuality, you will find all forms of, you know, you will find multiple partners, you know, group sex and so on. So it indicates, it reflects the social structures that came to an end with the growth of Bhagavad-Gita as a philosophical text in Hindu religion. So you can follow anyone, but if you are not following the teachings of Bhagavad-Gita, then you are doing bad karma. You can never get reincarnation. You will never get salvation.
Well, let's say that Marxism were to succeed, and well, perhaps the Soviet Union was a very bad example of that, but let's just suppose that something like that would happen. Would karma not also help justify, say, the wrongdoings and whatever wrong could come out of that, and say, well, it is also bad karma, and well, somehow that makes it okay. If it is possible, then perhaps
let's for a second forget about Marxism and socialism. Let's reflect on the realities of life. You know, to reflect on the realities of life, no need to be a Marxist. You just see the society around you, see the practices around you. Forget about, you know, Marxism is not a theology. Dialectical materialism is not ephemeral. It's just a method to understand history. The same way, you just forget Marxism, Marxist philosophy. Forget Bhabani as a Marxist for 5 seconds. Maximum 5 seconds. Reflect on the realities of life. You know, if you reflect on the realities of life, you can see the way capital creates consciousness to overcome its own contradictions. For example, Luigi's talk, he was using, indirectly the writings of Edward Bernays, who is the nephew of Sigmund Freud, who has written this book called Propaganda, just 82 pages book. It says if you can manipulate the minds of the people, you can rule them. And advertisement industry does that. So forget about the success of Marxism. We're thinking about whether we as human beings, we as a society, whether we will be able to sustain ourselves in front of the free market culture or not. Forget about whether Marxism will be successful or not. Let's learn from the historic mistakes of Soviet experiment. Let's think about whether we can sustain ourselves as individuals in front of the market culture, in front of the consumer culture. So Bhagavad-Gita, it really gives a justification to the individuals to sustain one's own life by internalizing the crisis. If a person like me, if I don't develop in my career, or if I don't salary at the end of the month, I blame my own, I blame the system, I go crazy, I'll get heart attack. If I believe in Bhagavad-Gita, I get an immediate answer. What is that answer? It's my own karma, it's from my previous karma. So I internalize the crisis. So Bhagavad-Gita, again, let me use the Marxist phrase, religion is the voice of the voiceless and the heart of the heartless. So Bhagavad-Gita really helps the working class from committing suicide. They don't commit suicide because, they internalize the crisis. Okay, let's work and, next life, I'll be rich, I'll be a corporate head. The theological promise of neoliberalism. Today is the boom, today is the crisis time, tomorrow it will be a boom. So let's work for tomorrow. Bhagavad-Gita is a text. Google organizes workshops on Bhagavad-Gita. So you can see that how Bhagavad-Gita is a management textbook in US today. Most of the business schools in US today, they teach Bhagavad-Gita. Most of the management gurus are from India today. They use Bhagavad-Gita as the text because you can domesticate the work and the individual together.
Great. So why don't we break for lunch? So thank you very much.